Okay, welcome back from a very brief coffee break. The next one, I promise, is going to be a bit longer. So, our next speaker is Davison Faustino. Davison Faustino is a doctor in sociology and professor of the postgraduate program in social work at the Federal University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Welcome in Germany. He studies the relationship between technology and society from Frantz Fanon anti-colonial perspective. Now Davison will present on AI, digital colonialism, and coded racialization, subsidies for a global agenda. Please join me in welcoming Davison on the stage, and the floor is yours.
Hi. Thank you for inviting me for stay here. I have a big challenge because my English is so bad, but we can do it together, okay? My intent here is to offer a sociological approach to AI. My point is how digital technologies, which I include AI, intensify old forms of exploitation, domination, and oppression. To this, I will present three concepts that I developed in my book. My book, unfortunately, we have not translated to English, but I will take about the digital colonialism, the primitive data accumulation, and coded racialization. I propose a hacker Fanonian approach or Hackian-Fanonian perspective for the debate on the ethical aspect of AI. It's important to think that every technique is social technical. That's important to think the ethical aspect. The ethical aspect of IA sometimes always the ethical aspect of AI cannot be separated from the broader economic context of the big data or big techs. For example, the development of AI has moved now in the direction of investor profit. Ethical aspects have been systematically ignored. The second point is that that approach is that automation is not teleology. That's important because generative AI, for example, that does not increase profits is immediately recalibrated, but sometimes the debate is made like how AI are a subject, but AI is a process made by humans, marked by some social relation. We need to talk about that social relation. If there is a process that has become autonomous to make it human, it's not a machine, but the capitalism, for example, that guides its designer and application. The third point for we begin is I call technological fetish. This can appear both as a technophilia, like the belief in the human redemption by machines or algorithms, but also we can talk about technophobia, the belief that machines will dominate us. Both trends is the problem when we stop to think the social relations that involve some technology. Well, I will talk about the concept of digital colonialism. three authors are so important to think that. The first one is Marx, a student from Bonn University, you know. Marx said in Das Kapital that colonial system was so important to development capitalism. But after him, Rosa Luxemburgo showed that colonialism is not limited to the initial period of capitalism development. That's so important to think the structural crisis of capital today. But the third thinker is Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon showed the dialectical relationship between capitalism, colonialism, and racism. That's my point here to think AI. Sorry. What Michael Quetch is a South African sociologist said, thinking that discussion about colonialism and the contemporary presence of colonialism in capitalist society, he argues to existence of contemporary colonialism. That's so important for us. For him, Michael Quetch, there are a digital colonialism. Digital colonialism for him is the use of digital technology for the political, economic, and social domination of another nation or territory. What Michael Quetch will do is compare the communication infrastructure of the 19th century with those of the 21st century, and argues that the existence of particular type of colonialism he calls digital colonialism. I think you know that, but we can compare the infrastructure of telegraphy with the optical fiber. Is that optical fiber structure, because they connect the world, but it is centralized. It's a kind of exportation of capital and form of control, geopolitical domination. I propose use that concept, Michael Quetch concept of digital colonialism, but I think we need to expand that concept to include other aspects in that debate. I bring for debate Frantz Fanon and Kwame Nkrumah, because Kwame Nkrumah argues for the vitality of colonialism. He calls about new colonialism. That's so important to understand the development of digital infrastructure, but the contemporary forms of domination in the world. For Frantz Fanon, colonialism is violence in the gross state. He in the wretched of the earth, he calls for he shows the violent aspect of colonial system, but that violence is connected with welfare state or development in the western, in the center of the capitalism. Violence is combined with democracy, but democracy is concentrated in certain place of the world, but that democracy cannot be separated by violence and dictatorship and other problems in the third world. But Kwame Nkrumah is a Ghanaian thinker and so important for Ghana history. For him, the colonialism doesn't finish with independence. That's so important because I prefer to work with Kwame Nkrumah than other important thinkers like Aníbal Quijano. For example, Quijano talk about coloniality because for him the independence finished colonial process, colonial system, but continues with coloniality model of power and being. But for Kwame Nkrumah, colonialism doesn't finish with independence, but it's converting the new forms of colonialism. He calls it like a new colonialism. Uh, uh, for him, the essence of new colonialism is that the state, which is subject to it, is in theory independent and has all the outward trapping of international sovereignty, but in the really, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside by finance by intellectual approach or political force. That's important for understand the development of digital technology in the world. And I propose to think it in terms of digital colonialism because the development of digital technology are marked by that continuation of colonial system and colonial violence sometimes. Digital colonialism is the unequal and combined distribution of benefits and violence typical of technological development, guided by the cyberpunk combination of high-tech, low-life. The distribution of risk are not equal, and we need to talk about it when we talk about digital technology and AI. Here, my comrade before said about that. Here's the profit of the five main entrepreneurs of technology. If the profit of the five largest technology company in 1 year is greater than the GDP of the Germany or Japan, for example. But that profit comes from offering new technology, of course, but they often depend of environmental destruction and the exploitation of child or semi-slave labor in the third world country. We can say about Kenya or Democratic Republic of Congo, but we can say about Bolivia and any place that inequality is part of that development. We need to talk about it. But in the last 15 years, a new forms of extractivism has emerged, and that is a point to think AI, because how can we can check in these studies. I think you know that Google, Meta, Microsoft, and others developed business models that exploit users' internet access data as a new commodity. There are a debate if commodity is the best terms to define data, but the point is other. The point is a new form of exploitation and extractivism. This violent data extraction I call primitive data accumulation, thinking with Marx, the idea of primitive accumulation, because there are a violence in that process of extraction, how can I say? Extraction, yeah, yeah. That violent extraction we can call primitive data accumulation. But there is also colonialism here because culture in the global south are being reduced to mere data providers to train algorithms model in the north. That creates new colonialism in new forms of transference of value in Marxist terms to we think. Uh, the third aspect of my speech is coded racialization. Uh, uh, Here we have, let me show. Here we have an experiment where we and my partner in that book, we did experiment with DAWI, with generative AI, where we insert the following prompts. Sigmund Freud, you know Freud, on the coach with Dr. Frantz Fanon as the psychoanalyst in the style of lithography. Frantz Fanon, do you remember? Frantz Fanon is that guy, okay? In our here, okay. In our experiment that we create Frantz Fanon because we put that prompt, doctor, you know, doctor, and it creates a white guy. Okay. After we did the second prompt, Fanon in the street of the Kabash, Fanon lived in Algeria, conversing with the locals in 1956, immersed in the vibrant and bustling atmosphere of the area, and it created Fanon. How can I say alto? Tall, and in the center of the people. What's the matter? What's the matter? We call it black skin, white hallucination. Can you understand? Because hallucination is the term of when artificial intelligence or generative intelligence create a product different from the reality. But why should a white hallucination worry us? When many studies in different parts of the world are showing a racial and gender bias in the AI. Two studies to know. The first one, they in United States, it was proving that AI programs for the organ donation prioritized the recommendation of less serious white people to the detriment of more serious black people to receive organs. In Brazil, another study show that 83% of those unfairly arrested by biometric algorithm are black. Can you understand my English? Yeah. That's so problematic because without AI, we have inequalities, health inequality in the United States. Without AI, before AI, we had mass incarceration of black population in Brazil. But when technology are not thinking or linked in the context of social injustice, it can how can I say fortalecer?
Strengthen.
Strength?
Strengthen.
Strengthen the inequality. That's the point for us to think. Uh, uh, Professor Tarcísio Silva in Brazil argued for essence of algorithm racism. For him, algorithm racism is the way in which systemic discrimination practices. We can think in terms of gender or language or regions, but the way in which systemic discrimination practices are driving by digital and automation technology created in a white supremacy ideology, because technology are not neutral, but the problem is not neutrality only. The problem is which reality is used as parameter to construct models. That's the problem that we need to think about. And usually the experience used as model are from global north, or have a white or European or United States people as model that create or potentialize inequality all of the world. Uh, my my question, yeah, I have a question, not answer, but my question is how to build algorithms parameters sensitive to cultural diversity. I think that seminar will answer it. Is show different possibility to answer it. But how to build algorithms parameters sensitive to cultural diversity when logical, symbolic, and economic power is concentrated in the global north? Uh, I, I I think we have a challenge because uh, I like to think digital colonialism in three big aspects. One is infrastructural and geopolitical aspect. There are some authors studying it, Michael Quate, Abiba Birhani, but there are other aspects, important aspect is cosmo techniques and in algorithms aspect. I think you know Yuki Hui or Rua Benjamin. They are interested in the cultural aspect and the whole work, the diversity, cultural diversity, or cultural or social diversity in the process of building algorithms. But there are a third aspect for me so important because for Fanon is so important also when we think domination is the psychopolitical aspect of that domination, because a logical uh, domination creates also a kind of subjectivity. A subjectivity is formed or influenced by social and logical process, and we can talk about a kind of psychopolitics. But I, my point is how to build. I will repeat my question. How to build algorithms parameters sensitive to cultural diversity when we have that three aspect, because sometimes the debate focus one of that aspect and ignore others. Can we think in cultural terms when we have infrastructural challenge to I think it's infrastructural, the hardware, but also the participation of different groups in the decision space. How can we think that things when logical, symbolic, and economic power is concentrated in global north? Uh, I believe that answer must articulate these three dimensions. The functional other question for us is that the functioning of AI depends of the quantification of life and subjectivity or experience. But human experience is not reducible, reduced, reducible. Human experience is not reducible to mathematics aspect. Language, dreams, desires, fear, empathy, resentment, affections matter. Politics is marked by that aspect. But AI quantify experience. That's so important. We can have many answers for different aspects of life, but life is not reducible to quantification. Isn't it's time to talk about the risk of mathematical colonization when AI become the main mediation for human decision and all levels of life, because we are living, because there are a perfect question here, because in some aspect is how can I say lucrativo, profitable substitute human labor for automatic process, but that's automatic process are made or marked by quantification of reality. And my question when we think colonization is also to think the risk of a kind of colonization of the life for that metrification or quantification of experience, and in addition quantification of life. Yes, but that's our question for we think together, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Davis, for your talk. Went really great. So we open the floor again for questions. We hand out a microphone. Yes, I see the first one over there, Doji. Just wait a second for the microphone.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. I was fascinated when you talk of the hacker, because we all have these goosebumps and fears when you hear a hacker. But immediately you put in the Fanonian perspective, I fell in love with it, because the idea of Fanon has been cleared. Colonization or colonialism use violence. To overcome that to overcome colonialism, you must also use violence. So I love it, the perspective. So those who can use that violence when it comes to the digital space are the hackers. I think I must learn to be a hacker myself. So thank you for that perspective.
Quem consegue superar isso, esses valores na colonização, que é uma parte do combate, se torna um hacker por si próprio.
Posso falar em português e você traduz? Acho mais fácil. Nós usamos a ideia de hacker porque o hacker lembra um espírito subversivo que estava presente no período inicial de desenvolvimento das tecnologias digitais.
Yeah, the hackers are like a subversive, combative spirit that was in the early beginnings of the discussion on technology and digital technology as a whole. That's why they use it a lot, this figure of the hacker.
Frantz Fanon era um crítico da violência colonial, mas ele lembrava que essa violência só pode ser combatida com uma quebra, com um hack desse sistema de dominação. E essa quebra implica uma mobilização de todas as pessoas afetadas por essa violência.
Yeah, and Fanon himself was a critical of colonial violence, but you could only combat this violence through hacking, through breaking up with this system. And so it would be a hack of the domination system of colonialization, and this implied the mobilization of all those who are impacted by this colonial system.
E para ele, a tecnologia poderia ser uma arma colonial, mas ela também pode, quando apropriada pelos colonizados, ela também pode ser uma forma de luta contra a violência colonial.
Yeah, and technology could be a colonial weapon, but when appropriated by those impacted by this colonization, could be a way, also a weapon to tackle this colonial power, to overcome and to rebel against it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Davidson, right? Davidson. Yeah. All right. That's a very beautiful presentation. I love it, and I was particularly interested in the way you wanted to differentiate post-independent, I don't want to use post-colonial, but post-independent discourses, emancipatory discourses from Africa, which you represented by Kwame Nkrumah, and then from Southern America, which you represented by Anibal Cuyano. I never thought about it, but you made mention that Kwame Nkrumah never said colonialism ended. But then Anibal Cuyano says it ended, and so it started with coloniality, right? I was a little bit confused because Nkrumah also seems to say that, look, colonialism has ended, and it's manifesting in another form called neocolonialism. And then Anibal Cuyano and the other Southern Americans are also saying, no, colonialism ended, and is manifesting in a kind of continuous influence of colonialism, that colonialism is ongoing. So how do you differentiate? The differentiation was not clear to me about Kwame Nkrumah coming from Africa, and then the Southern Americans' idea about the emancipatory narratives. Thank you.
A primeira diferença é uma diferença espacial e temporal, porque as revoluções tratadas por Kwame Nkrumah acontecem no século XX, e as revoluções de independência tratadas por Aníbal Quijano acontecem no século XIX na América Latina.
So the first difference is that for him is that it is a spatial and temporal and temporal time.
Yeah.
Which is like in Africa that happened in the 20th century in that continent, whereas in Latin America it happened in the 19th century.
Yeah, but for Quijano, the independence, a independência ela termina com o colonialismo, mas ainda se mantém na América Latina um tipo de relação de poder baseado na colonialidade. E ele fala de colonialidade do ser, do saber e do poder.
Mm-hmm. In Latin America, Quijano understands that independence finishes with colonialism, but there's a power relationship based on a coloniality of being, knowledge and power.
Porém, para Kwame Nkrumah, as independências elas podem ser capturadas pelas forças coloniais numa nova forma de colonialismo. Aqui há uma diferença com a ideia do Aníbal Quijano, e por isso que eu acho mais interessante a perspectiva do Kwame Nkrumah.
He says that for Kwame Nkrumah. Yeah, sorry, I didn't know this author before, but I'm definitely going to read him afterwards. Independence can be captured by colonial forces in a new form of colonialism. And this would be the difference between him and Quijano, certo?
Porque, para mim, e estou pensando com Samir Amin, o colonialismo ele não se finda com os processos de dependência, mas ele se atualiza no período atual do desenvolvimento capitalista.
Okay, just one second. But for Davidson, and he's reading also Samir Amin, in the sense, colonialism doesn't end with the independence processes, but it updates itself into a new form of relationship, but which is ongoing, right?
Yeah, but the idea of coloniality from Quijano is so important to understand the way of powers, but I think we need more, and I think Kwame Nkrumah is important to understand the contemporary way of capitalism.
Thank you.
And it's so important to understand the digital distribution of risk and violence.
So that's perfect. I wanted to follow up on the discussion and discuss it in sort of the digital colonialism that you were talking about. So from what we heard in the earlier presentation and also what you were speaking about with the hidden labor, the data labeling camps, the variety of things that are happening in the digital space and this new form of colonialism, how do you hack that? Because it's also my understanding, you know, working with Doji and Modesta, and we talked about the mining communities, so colonialism in the extraction of minerals, and how the communities are so dependent on these awful living conditions. But, you know, it's been said to me, Amy, you can't get rid of the mining industry. We need that to survive. So are we now repeating that when we have the labeling camps and the variety of jobs related to the digital infrastructure? And will we then be in a situation where we say, we now need this in order for our communities to survive? How do you hack that? Because Doji's our new hacker, right? So what is Doji going to do?
Yeah, I understand everything, but I don't know all answer. Whole answer. Vou tentar em inglês e se eu não conseguir
Beleza,
você me
beleza,
ajuda. In Brazil, we are talking about digital sovereignty as a possibility to connect different aspects of that debate with the asking for claim for development of infrastructure and governance, democratic governance process where different people participate of that process, and we are talking about the different cultures and the importance of considering different cultures, but I think it's not sufficient to hack the process, but I think is the beginning of the movement. But it's so important to connect that different aspect, because if we think only in terms of culture, we can fall in a kind of new extractivism, in the cultural extractivism, because for AI it's important also know different cultures to improving its system. It's not sufficient to think in terms of different culture. We need to think in terms of power. But it's for me is a great agenda that we need to building together with people in different parts of the world. But I think I cannot answer your question satisfactorily. Yeah, because I think the answer needs to be building together.
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up? So, yeah, I know it was a hard question. That was a mean question. I'm so sorry for that. And I was also thinking about, you know, in Samuel's presentation, you talked about the billions that were invested for the fiber optic cables in Africa. And so then, do you think it would be up to the African government to say, no, we don't want it? I mean, is that part of the hack? It seems impossible also to say no to that. But do you know what I mean? But it's such an unfair question. But that's what I'm thinking about. Sorry, and I'm hogging the mic.
There's a follow-up, and then there's a question in the back, and then here's another question, and then we'll organize the rest.
Just to follow up to that question, I've worked for several years at the World Bank. So what kind of ask would you have? Like, what's the role of multilateral institutions, international financial institutions that go to these countries and work with the government ministries in, you know, mobilizing billions of dollars of funding to undersea cables or, you know, digital infrastructure, capacity, skills? Like, what would be an ask for us to maybe change our perspective or change the way that we engage with these policymakers in African countries?
Mais ou menos. Mas
Tá.
ela pergunta.
Ela quer, tipo, ela trabalha no Banco Mundial, hoje ela trabalha no GIZ, mas ela quer saber qual é o papel das instituições multilaterais nisso, tipo, esses órgãos de financiamento e tal. O que eles têm que se perguntar, o que eles têm que pensar a esse respeito para, tipo, não ser coloniais quando estiverem financiados por, tipo, cabo submarino e etc.
Eu vou responder em português, aí você traduz.
Tipo, tem uma outra pergunta que quer esperar ela e responde em bloco?
Pode ser em bloco.
Ok, beleza, ok.
Okay, I'm going to try to talk without waking him up. So, my question is, so I'm a researcher and my focus is AI from the African perspective. And currently I'm just like looking from a practitioner perspective and, trying to see what is actually happening on the ground. So leaving out the government because, we have corrupt governments in Africa, so the money is not reaching the people. And now my question is, so you brought about, you introduced the aspect of Kwame Nkrumah, who I really admire because the people I'm talking to right now in Africa, the practitioners, they're all like, we're not looking at, we don't have this nationalistic perspective. We're looking at Africa as a whole. So when they are, if it's a startup, some of them are even social entrepreneurs, they're like, I'm not looking at my country alone. I'm looking at Africa as my market, also as my customers. And I think that is like also the solution to breaking this cycle of colonialism. Now my question, is, how is it in Brazil? Because I sometimes have a feeling that the practitioners, they are faster than us researchers. How is this movement? How is, anti-colonialism, anti-neocolonialism? How is it taking up in the country?
Tá. Tipo, bom, ela falou que ela é uma... ela é da parte técnica. You're from the technical community, right? As far as I could understand, like a computer scientist?
Yeah, it's technical.
More or less.
Practice, right?
E tipo, ela tem trabalhado de uma perspectiva africana e ela sempre pensa que, porra, é difícil você pensar nisso falando com a comunidade, né? Normalmente o governo é corrupto, o dinheiro não chega lá. E ela achou massa você trazer o Nkrumah porque ele fala porque, tipo, ela fala que os movimentos na África têm sido muito de uma África enquanto continente, enquanto região, mas não tanto de uma perspectiva nacionalista. E ela quer saber como é que é isso no Brasil. Tipo, normalmente os técnicos, as empresas são mais rápidas que pesquisadores. Como é que esse é um movimento anticolonial no Brasil?
Ok. Sobre a questão das agências multilaterais, uma das preocupações que surgiram no Brasil no século XX era que muitas vezes o apoio financeiro dessas agências era submetido a certas políticas de austeridade que prejudicavam o desenvolvimento local. Esse é um problema que precisa ser pensado do ponto de vista dos apoios das agências, como o Banco Mundial, por exemplo.
This says that regarding multilateral institutions, one of the things that happened a lot in Latin America as a whole, but especially in Brazil, was that financial support was always subject to many measures of austerity, which inhibited local development.
Outro problema é que precisamos pensar em apoios que garantam transferência de tecnologia. Mas isso é um grande desafio, num momento em que as tecnologias digitais caminham para uma exportação de serviços e não de tecnologias. Mas a gente precisa pensar como desenvolver infraestruturas de tecnologia nos países do terceiro mundo.
Infrastructure. So when thinking about this financial support, we need to make sure that they also aim to transfer technology itself. This nowadays is quite challenging because digital technologies are moving towards more a transference and offering of services instead of technology. So we need to think also, having this in mind, we need to think on how to build infrastructure in this country so that they also can develop their own systems, their own services and technologies after they receive this financial support.
Yeah. E sobre a questão nacional, é importante lembrar que o Kwame Nkrumah era um pan-africanista que acreditava em saídas regionais para os problemas da África. E isso incluía a atenção a problemas locais. Para ele, as saídas regionais poderiam fortalecer e dar respostas para os problemas locais.
What he says is that Nkrumah was a Pan-Africanist, which believed in regional solutions for the problems that the African continent had. And this included attention to local issues as well. So his main idea would be to, through regional efforts, to support local solutions.
Mas é verdade que o debate sobre a tecnologia ele acontece no âmbito nacional e ele exige políticas nacionais de cada governo.
Yeah, but it's also true that the debate on tech happens within national fora, and so we need national solutions for that.
Aqui temos um problema, porque nem sempre os governos estão engajados em agendas que beneficiem a sua própria população.
But we have an issue because not always governments are engaged in initiatives that benefit their own populations.
Por isso, o claim, o chamado para o pan-africanismo é também um chamado para que a sociedade civil, as organizações, os movimentos sociais se articulem não só nacionalmente, mas também globalmente.
So the claim for Pan-Africanism is also a call so that civil society articulates not only locally, but also internationally and globally.
Para nós no Brasil e para nós nos consideramos diáspora africana nas Américas, esse chamado do Kwame Nkrumah nos acolhe e abre a possibilidade para pensar uma agenda em articulação entre a América e a África, mas também a articulação com movimentos de outras partes do mundo, como na Ásia e até na Europa.
Yeah, in Brazil, especially the population considers itself as descending from the African diaspora.
Yeah.
In the Americas, they interpret this call of Nkrumah as an invitation for articulation between the Americas and Africa.
Yes, em outra parte do mundo.
And other parts of the world as well.
Como Ásia e inclusive Europa.
Yes, including Asia and also Europe.
Mas isso... time.
Yeah, we'll go to the next question. Maybe
Okay,
you can
okay.
discuss later during the coffee break to give a chance.
Okay.
Here.
I'm sorry to cut this off, but
Yeah.
short. But one question I have, the follow-up again from the other questions. So don't you think because there are some of the hacks, right? So already there are proposals of DPI, digital public infrastructure, building digital public infrastructure in the global south, especially, and even Europe. Because Europe also sees this as a colonialism, right? So data colonialism coming from the U.S. and then it's actually engulfing Europe. So that's one hack, and the second hack is commons-based, community-based technology development, or commons-based like AI Commons in the open source, building through open source communities. That's one hack, and the third hack is technology transfers in the lieu of market access. So if you don't give technology, we don't give market access to you. So this is another hack. And going to the WTO and then rebelling what you said, another data flows, like what kind of data flows, how they should flow from north to south, and then across the countries, because there is now already a complex negotiations where the low regulatory barriers for data flow are negotiated in the WTO. So which a lot of global south countries wants to strengthen the regulatory system so that the flows are the sovereignty is protected, right? The data sovereignty. So these are some of the hacks. But what do you think of these? Would this work in the global south, or these all are mostly fantasies in the academic or policy circles? And what kind of politics discourse you see in the global south, especially in the Latin America where you come from? So that's my question. Thank you.
Tá. Ele falou que existem propostas já de hackear isso. Uma delas é por infraestrutura pública digital. Outra também desenvolvimento tecnológico baseado nas comunidades. Então, discursos comuns, comunidade open source e tal. E também na transferência de tecnologia. De, tipo, um país falar, se você não me transfere essa tecnologia, eu não te dou acesso ao meu mercado. Então, isso é uma primeira parte. E ele perguntou, tipo, como é que os dados devem fluir, então. Já existem algumas negociações complexas, tipo, no âmbito da OMC, para que países tenham uma barreira regulatória menor para que eles recebam influxo de dados, só que os países do sul global estão querendo impor uma barreira regulatória maior para tipo eles terem mais soberania. Então ele quer saber se essas formas de hacking podem funcionar ou se elas são só um sonho.
Quer já emendar a segunda pergunta, a última pergunta para fechar?
Do you want to make it in block just so that he just
To
says
finish?
one to finish?
No, the last question is a follow-up question over there, so you can answer to him, and then the last question
Okay.
comes here.
Okay.
Então responda agora, né?
So he responds now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sorry, I didn't get it as well.
Okay. I think that is the way of RAC, but I think the debate about RAC can be influenced by decolonial perspective. But I think that example are important example of resistance from resistência contra o colonial, against colonial processes are important. But in Brazil, we have important movement about open source and digital
sovereignty.
Digital sovereignty, but sometimes that debate cannot include indigenous people or black people, and sometimes that debate can suffering of white hallucination also. And we can mix different struggle in that way, but I think that is the beginning.
And one last follow-up question.
Actually, also follow up on the open source communities that you just mentioned, Nadine from GIZ Fair Forward. So, for example, we are also supporting and working quite a bit with local language communities, for example, in the sub-Saharan African continent. And one great challenge that we encountered when it comes to collecting these open data sets, that then big tech companies actually leverage on them to build their products, which is a little bit exactly what we are wondering whether you would maybe have a perspective of what ways could be to also navigate a way to have open source that allows people to innovate jointly, to build on each other, while also mitigating the danger that those who have the resources available leverage exactly on this content. I know that's also quite of a mean question, but maybe you have a perspective on that.
Could you just repeat the final part of it? You said how to support open source communities to help people cooperate and innovate.
I would rather say it's about how would you mitigate the challenge of open source data sets, or also models in the end, that can be very easily leveraged by big tech companies that already hold the power, right? And then they kind of use the knowledge that's communally collected to build the profit for those who already have the profit available.
Ok, thanks. Ela trabalha com open source, é do GIZ, que é a Agência de Cooperação Alemã, tá ligado, né? E ela fala que o GIZ colabora com comunidades que têm línguas locais na África subsaariana, e que eles têm um desafio já na coleta de dados, que tipo, quando você consegue criar essa base de dados open source, as big techs já crescem em cima para lucrar com isso, que elas capturam isso. Então, como é que ela quer saber como mitigar esse desafio de bases de dados open source que podem ser capturadas e usadas pelas big techs? Como fazer com que esse conhecimento fique nas comunidades, não seja um objeto de extrativismo, sabe?
Difficult question. Vou responder em português, que é mais difícil. Há 20 anos atrás, o debate sobre software livre e sobre fontes abertas era o que existia de mais subversivo na discussão sobre tecnologias digitais. Mas me parece que o desenvolvimento tecnológico está mudando essa tendência de subversão.
So he says that 20 years ago, the open source and open software discussions were what we had of more subversive in the discussion on big tech. However, the technological development as it is today is changing this trend.
Por exemplo, how can I say, Android? Se eu compro um celular da Samsung, eu só consigo usar o celular porque existe o Android que se utiliza de fontes abertas. Ou se a gente pensar, por exemplo, a OpenAI, o grande trunfo da OpenAI é poder lançar mão de fontes abertas para poder treinar os seus modelos. Isso talvez nos provoca a pensar quais são os desafios neste estágio de desenvolvimento tecnológico.
So it says that, for instance, if I buy a Samsung mobile phone, he only can use it. He can only use it because there is Android within it, which benefits from open source technology. And OpenAI is the same thing. The main asset that it has is because it could use many open source tools, techniques to train their own models. So we need to think like what are the challenges? How can we solve these challenges in this state of development?
Eu penso que dos caminhos passa pela luta, pelo desenvolvimento de infraestruturas e tecnologias locais para poder tratar os dados, mas, sobretudo, para que esses dados possam responder às necessidades locais. E isso implica um debate que passa pelo desenvolvimento de infraestruturas no terceiro mundo.
Okay, so he thinks that one of the possibilities is the struggle towards the development of local infrastructures for processing this data, and so that this data can respond to the necessities of these local communities. So maybe going back to the community level, right?
Mas eu penso que uma grande tarefa da nossa época é garantir a participação de de representantes de diferentes culturas e realidades nos processos de governança da inteligência artificial, para que esse desenvolvimento incorpore as diferentes perspectivas.
Our main task now is to make sure that we have participation from different cultures in the processes of AI governance, so that this development really reaches their interests. Certo?
Yeah, is that.
Give another round of applause. We now have again 15 minutes coffee break, and I'll see you back here at 12:15, so it's 5 minutes longer than last time. And yeah, please again, no drinks, coffee from inside of the library.